All right, everybody. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with this morning's session. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I know that we're all in for a treat to hear about Dr. Hackenberg's presentation. My name is Abby Pastorella. I'm one of the consultants for the Patent Autism Initiative. My colleagues, Brooke and Danielle, are in the back, and we will all be facilitating this session. So if anybody needs anything, please feel free to ask one of us. Let us know. So before I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Hackenberg, we have to go over some announcements. So the exhibit hall is open today until 5 o'clock. Quiet rooms are available should you need them. Those are in rooms 113 and 114. There is a nursing room available that's located in room 116. Amir Stapuglia and Mike Miklos will be presenting a special session this afternoon called Not Just Autism, Generic Extension of Effective Practice Across Special Education Settings from 4:30 until 6 in the President's Hall. Remember, in order to get continuing education credits, you must complete and hand in a verification form at the registration desk prior to departing on your last day of attendance. This is where you will put the codes given at the end of each presentation. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, or if you just registered today, it's that yellow form. You're going to need to submit the codes per that form. You can access the PowerPoint and any handouts for the session via the conference website, and you can also download the Sched app to access your personalized schedule. We're also asking upon completion of each presentation that you provide us with some feedback for that session via the conference website. Also know that in room 115, we have the patent pod, so please feel free to stop by and share your comments about the conference. Okay, so it is my honor to introduce Dr. Tim Hackenberg. Dr. Hackenberg received his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of California, Irvine in 1982, and a doctorate in psychology from Temple University in 1987, under the supervision of Philip Heinlein. He held a postdoctoral research position at the University of Minnesota with Travis Thompson from 1988 to 1990. He served on the faculty in the Behavior Analysis program at the University of Florida from 1990 to 2009 and is currently a professor of psychology at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. He has served on the board of directors for both the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior and the Society for the Quantitative Analysis of Behavior, and as associate editor of the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. Dr. Hackenberg was president of Division 25 of the American Psychological Association, experimental representative to the ABAI Council, and director of the ABAI Science Board. His major research interests are in the areas of behavioral economics and social behavior. In work funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, he and his students have developed procedures for cross-species comparisons of behavior. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Hackenberg.
Thank you, Abby. All right, thank you so much, Abby, for that very kind introduction. It's a delight to be here. I always enjoy this meeting, and it's an honor to be invited to present. So I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for coming out. When I looked at the program and I saw Vince Carbone and Tim Vollmer and other people presenting this morning in concurrent sessions, I thought we might just have a small group that we could, go and grab some coffee and chat. So I'm really pleased to welcome you here today. I'm going to be talking today about social behavior, which is a topic of enormous conceptual importance. It is a rapidly growing and interdisciplinary field that is, that's approached by several different disciplines, including social psychology, behavioral economics, comparative psychology, behavioral neuroscience, to name just a few. Conspicuous by its absence on the slide is our field of behavior analysis. This, despite some very promising work that was done in the early days of the field in the 60s and 70s, the topic has received relatively scant attention within the field of behavior analysis over the past few decades. This is also a time period during which the field of social behavior has literally taken off. It is one of the most rapidly growing and intensely researched areas in all of social and behavioral sciences. And so the absence of behavior analysis is really unfortunate, because I think that the field of behavior analysis has a lot to contribute, both methodologically and conceptually, as I hope to show you today. So my aims for the talk today are to review social behavior literature, and I should say right at the outset that I'm not going to review all of the literature. This is a vast topic, and so I'm going to provide really just a selective overview of certain areas designed to illustrate some larger principles. What I really want to get across is a conceptual framework for understanding social behavior from a behavior analytic perspective, through a behavior analytic lens. So what I hope to do today is to give you some tools, some conceptual tools for understanding social behavior from this point of view, so that you can go out then and look at findings, you can look at concepts and look at methods and fit them into an overarching conceptual framework. The literature review really doesn't make any sense without having some kind of a conceptual framework. And so that's really my main purpose today, is to sort of lay out this conceptual framework. I will also identify along the way some priorities for research and for application. But I will say, as a disclaimer right at the beginning, if it wasn't already clear from the introduction, I'm not a practitioner, I'm not an applied researcher. I approach the topic as an experimentalist. But I am deeply interested in translational research that goes from basic principles in the laboratory to application. And what I really hope to do today, my ambitious goal, is to open a dialogue with those of you who are applied researchers and practitioners, so we can talk about ways of pushing the field forward in all of its dimensions. So that's my more ambitious goal. And I should also say, just as a matter of style, I hope to have an interactive kind of session. As was mentioned in the introduction, I teach at a small liberal arts college, and so we don't do much lecturing there. We do discussion-oriented seminars and conferences. And so I'm very comfortable with this sort of interactive style. And so please feel free to interrupt me, to ask questions, to make comments throughout the session. I'm very comfortable in this kind of interruption mode. And this is really what I'm hoping to accomplish, to have more of a dialogue rather than just giving you a lecture. Okay? So feel free to interrupt me. So I said that I approached this as an experimentalist. I've spent most of my career in animal laboratories, in the presence of mainly of rats and pigeons, and which explains why I have such poor social skills. But I think that there are some advantages to looking at the field of social behavior through a comparative lens. And by comparative, I mean comparing social behavior across species, okay? And so the way that I think about this is that we humans are animals, after all. We're part of nature. We're part of the biological kingdom. And as such, we share important characteristics with other animals. Some of these characteristics are morphological, related to form and appearance. Some of them are behavioral. And that's where we live, in the behavioral realm. So to understand how we are unique as humans, and there are many ways in which we are, of course, especially in the realm of social behavior, which we'll be talking about. To understand how we're unique, it's first important to understand what we have in common with other animals. And it's only against this backdrop of commonality do our distinctive features stand out. So even if you're interested primarily in our kind, in humans, it's important to understand, for an overall comprehensive understanding of social behavior, it's important to understand what we have in common with other animals. So there's a sense in which we have to step outside of our humanness to really understand what makes us unique, okay? So I'll be talking a fair amount about social behavior in other animals and moving back and forth between humans and other animals. And this is really the essence of a comparative approach, looking both at the similarities, the broad-based similarities that cut across species, cut across settings and habitats, as well as the particular details of how particular processes play out for a given species in a given habitat. So whether we focus on the broad-based general principles or the specific details depends on the particular question we're asking, the particular lens, which we can adjust depending on the question. So let's start out with some definitions. Social behavior is such a vast area. It's one of these things that's really difficult to define in a way that is specific enough to provide some operational meaning, but also broad enough to capture the essence of social behavior and all of its ramifications. So when I'm stumped and looking for a definition of terms, I turn to Skinner, Keller, and Schoenfeld. And so that's what I've done here. We'll start with a definition of social behavior offered by Keller and Schoenfeld, 1950. This is from their Principles book. Keller and Schoenfeld say that social behavior may be described as behavior for which the reinforcing or discriminative stimuli are or have been mediated by the behavior of another organism. Okay, so let's let that sink in for a bit. What they seem to be saying is that we can treat social stimuli, that is, the behavior of others, we can treat the behavior of others as stimuli, and as such, then they can be plugged into our common three-term contingency framework. They can appear as motivational operations, they can appear as discriminative stimuli, they can appear as reinforcers, okay? So this goes some way, I think, to capturing social behavior. And, oops. The other part of the definition is offered by Skinner. And what Skinner says is that social behavior is behavior of two or more people with respect to one another or in concert with respect to a common environment. So what Skinner's definition adds is this, is the contingency, this interdependent contingency, where two or more individuals are acting in concert or in socially coordinated ways, okay? So let's put these two definitions together and offer a general definition. We'll say behavior is social. This is my provisional definition. It's subject to debate, but I'm going to say behavior is social when the behavior of others serves important behavioral functions, for example, discriminative stimuli, reinforcing stimuli, this is the Keller and Schoenfeld part, and or participates in interdependent contingencies, where two or more individuals are acting in concert. Skinner said people because this definition came from his book, Science and Human Behavior, so he was emphasizing social behavior in people, but I don't think Skinner would object to extending this to other species as well. So the question is then, what are these behavioral functions and contingencies? What are they? This is where I want to talk about the conceptual framework, functional analysis. So when we talk about functional analysis and behavior analysis, we're focused on the behavioral level of analysis, the variables of which behavior is a function. But there's a second meaning of functional that I think is important to lay out in trying to understand social behavior in the broadest possible sense. There's an evolutionary context that provides the basis for the functional analysis at the behavioral level. And so what I mean by function in the evolutionary sense is that social behavior has served important behavioral functions in the environments in which many species have evolved. Okay? This is what it means to be a social species, to have evolved in environments in which social behavior has had adaptive significance. Okay, it's had survival functions. So we say that these kinds of behaviors are selected by phylogenetic contingencies. And this is common in the animal world. Primates, birds, insects, there are all kinds of species for which social behavior has had adaptive significance. Okay? This is nowhere more evident than in our own species. Humans are the most socially embedded species on the planet. We're supercharged social species. If our ancestors hadn't developed ways of working together, coordinating their behavior, cooperating, and so on, we wouldn't be here today talking about this. So this has been crucial in the evolution of our species. And it's a good thing, too, because we are virtually helpless at birth. We're virtually helpless. We depend for our survival on the behavior of others. We're socially dependent. Biologists make a distinction between what they call precocial species and altricial species. Precocial species, this is related to the term precocious. These are animals that are pretty much born ready to take on the world. Okay, they're born able to survive in the relatively early days of their life. And altricial species, on the other hand, are those types of animals that, like us, that are literally dependent on others, that are helpless at birth. Even within birds, there's wide variation and along this dimension. It's even wider within mammals. The blue wildebeest, shown here, is an example of a species that's of a mammal, mammalian species that's very precocial. These are animals that can, wildebeest calves can walk within a few hours of being born. Okay, they usually give birth in the afternoon, so that by evening time, when the predators come out, they're able to keep up with their pack. Okay, they're able to keep up with their pack and avoid predators. So compare that to the human at 1 day old, virtually helpless. Okay, so the reason I'm talking about this is because this is part of what makes us such a strong social species. Because we're so dependent on others to meet our basic needs, to mediate our reinforcers, the behavior of others, what others are doing, takes on important behavioral functions. We pay attention to what others are doing in our environment. We have to, in order to survive. So this is seen in other strongly social species. Attention to and engagement with other animals, but it's the strongest in people. And this kind of social bonding that happens early in life then sets the stage for more complex and advanced social behavior, which develops throughout early childhood. Okay, so let's turn to the second meaning of functional. This is something that is more familiar to most of us. Well, here we're talking about functional analysis at the behavioral level. These are the variables of which behavior is a function. These are the processes that play out within the lifetime of the individual. Skinner had a great phrase called the natural lines of fracture, identifying the functional units of behavior through a functional analysis, through an experimental analysis. And so today what I'm going to emphasize in this functional analysis of social behavior is the reinforcement functions and the discriminative functions. So let's start with reinforcement. As I've just mentioned, the reinforcement functions, that is contingent access to social interaction. That's really what I mean by a reinforcement function of a social stimulus, contingent access to another organism. This, it goes without saying that this is prominently featured in human behavior. But you may be surprised to know that it's also been demonstrated in a wide range of other species. This is just a partial list here. There are many more species that have been studied for reinforcement functions. Okay, so in every one of the species shown here, under experimental conditions, contingent access to another organism has been shown to function as a reinforcer. These are, and I should say also that these are conspecific, so they're members of the same species. So they work to produce access to another member of their species. So social interaction, for opportunities for social interaction. So let's talk about rats. If we just restrict our focus to rats, there's an extensive literature showing that contingent access to social contact serves as a functional reinforcer for rats. And rats are particularly well suited to study for studying social behavior because, first of all, they're highly social species. They live in groups. They derive many benefits from social behavior. There are also practical reasons. Unlike some of the other animals I showed you on the previous slide, the social carnivores and the primates, they're not abundant in animal laboratories. Rats are relatively easy to study, and they meet many of our requirements for studying social behavior. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we go about assessing social reinforcement functions with rats. But think that these kinds of basic principles apply broadly. They apply beyond simply rats. So one of the laboratory methods that has become popular in the last decade for studying social reinforcement in rats is something called social release. And in this method, there are two rats, one of which is trapped in a restraint, the other of which is freely roaming outside of the restraint. And the question is, will this rat, and I should say that the restraint has a door on one end that can be lifted, permitting release of the trapped rat into the larger chamber for a period of social interaction. Okay, and so the question that was this was introduced in a paper by Ben Ami Bartal in 2011, and their question was whether this rat would release the other rat. Okay, whether it could learn to open the door and release the other rat for this period of social interaction. This was the title of the paper. Empathy and Pro-Social Behavior in Rats. It really created quite a stir in my field of animal behavior at the time, partly because it was published in Science, which is it's a very well-known, very renowned scientific journal, but also because of the provocative title, Empathy and Pro-Social Behavior in Rats. So this gives you a clue as to the author's interpretation of the social release behavior. So let me tell you first what they discovered, and then we'll circle back to this interpretation. So this was a group design, so all of the data are averaged across rats. So they're presenting the percent of the rats that learned to open the door over trials, over days. There was a single trial per day. 60-minute session. Halfway through the session, if the rat hadn't opened the door, the experimenters would open it part way, okay, and then as a kind of prompt for social release. About 2/3 of the rats eventually learned to do this, and they did it with shorter and shorter latencies on subsequent days. So it was clearly a learned behavior, and they ran the relevant control conditions with an empty tube, with a toy rat in the tube, which produced lower levels of door opening. So that the rats learned to open the restraint, I think, is beyond question. But why? Why did the rats learn to open the restraint? Their interpretation was based on empathy. So according to the authors, the trapped rat was in a state of distress, And this state of distress got passed on through something they called social contagion to the free rat, and the free rat then acted out of empathic concern for the trapped rat. And that is what explains the door opening. I see you chuckling, Charlie. So when my students and I looked at this, we thought, this is a really interesting method. And we looked at the videos, we looked at the data, but what we saw was not empathy, but social reinforcement. We saw this as an operant, basically social release. The opening of the door was an operant behavior that was reinforced by opportunities for social interaction. Okay? And they got to interact with this rat. This was a familiar rat, a cage mate, for the rest of the 1 hour session. Okay? So it was a long duration of social interaction. We know rats are highly social. We know that social contact can serve as a potent reinforcer. And so this seemed to us to be a really clear example of social reinforcement. The method had some limitations, though. As I mentioned, there was only a single opportunity to respond per session. It was a binary, either you open the door or you don't. Okay? And also, as I just mentioned, the duration of the social interaction, which we might think of as social reinforcement magnitude, was free to vary depending on when the rat opened the door. So both of these things are not exactly satisfying for people trained in behavior analysis. So we thought, this is an interesting paradigm, but we need to make it more rigorous. We need to refine the methods. And so our first thought was, let's put a lever on it. And this has become a kind of credo in my lab. When there's some vexing problem, I usually say, let's put a lever on it. And so my students made this T-shirt. Put a lever on it. It was actually a play on a skit that appeared in this quirky TV series called Portlandia. Put a bird on it. Anybody remember this? So my students, we lived in Portland, so my students made up this shirt, put a lever on it, and the rationale is more than just put a lever on it for the sake of putting a lever on it. What are the advantages of putting a lever on it? What are some of the advantages? You could do a behavioral economic analysis. What do you mean by that?
You can see how much they really want to free the other rat.
All right, I like the way you're thinking. I like that. So that's exactly what we were thinking, that if you put a lever on it, you can determine not only whether they will release the other rat, but how much they're willing to work to release the other rat. Okay? And you can also then control the access to the reinforcer, to the period of social interaction. So what we did was we took the restraint tube, just like the one that was used in the original study, but instead of having the rat manually open it, we just hooked it up to a lever. So now a lever press would open a door and allow the trapped rat to escape into a main chamber for a period of social interaction, a timed period of social interaction, and then we'd put the rat back into the tube for the next trial. Okay, so here's how it works. All right, so that looks like a reinforcer, huh? So as I said, we put the rat back in, and this permitted multiple opportunities each session to to interact, provide multiple opportunities to respond and to produce social interaction as a reinforcer. So we there we go. So we basically then asked, if this is a reinforcer, then does it look like a reinforcer? Does it walk like a reinforcer? We just take it through its behavioral paces and ask, what happens if we go from an FR1 schedule to a progressive ratio schedule? How much are they willing to work to produce access to this reinforcer? So a progressive ratio schedule, for those of you who are not schedule aficionados, this is a type of schedule where the requirements for reinforcement increase systematically with each reinforcer delivered by the schedule. So in our original schedule, I think we used a PR1. So after each reinforcer, the requirements would increase by one response. Okay? And then we look at how much are they willing to work before they give up. We also, of course, if this is going to be a reinforcer, we've got to study this under extinction. So break the contingency between responding and social interaction and see what happens to behavior. We also, because this is a kind of uncommon reinforcer, we wanted to see how it compared to other more commonly used reinforcers like food. Okay, so we compared it to food reinforcement, and we also manipulated motivational variables, so social deprivation. So in these conditions, the rats would, rather than go back into their home cage, I should say that all of our rats are pair housed, so they live with a cage mate. But under these social motivation conditions, we took out the other rat, and they were deprived of access until the next session. So similar to food deprivation. And I don't have time to go into all of the details of these findings, but I will just point you to a recent paper that we published in Behavioral Processes that lays out in more detail these methods and results. So I will say simply that this initial exploration convinced us that we were dealing with a bona fide reinforcer, that contingent access to social contact functioned as a reinforcer according to the usual tests of reinforcement. We then decided to push this a bit further. Oops, I keep doing that. We decided to push this a bit further and use behavioral economic methods that are designed to quantify reinforcement value. So one of the common methods in behavioral economics is derived from something called a demand function. So in a demand function, we have consumption that's plotted against price. Okay, so consumption is translated into behavioral terms. This is the number of reinforcers. Okay, the amount of reinforcement that you gain in a session as a function of the cost, and the cost is usually specified in laboratory experiments as the number of responses to produce the reinforcer. And just to give you a sense of the generality of this basic function, so this applies to virtually all commodities. Any type of reinforcer has these characteristics where at a low price, you get a lot of it, but then as the price gets higher and higher, you might, like let's say you're addicted to coffee like I am, you're willing to pay if the price of coffee goes up. Let's say it starts at $3, goes up to $3.50, you're still willing to pay it. Up to $4, maybe. At some point, you're going to go, no, I'm going to go to some other place. I'm going to drink tea, or I'm going to go get coffee at a different store. And this turns over. Okay, so this general function is characteristic of all reinforcers, from coffee to gasoline. In the laboratory, it's as I said, this is usually studied with, the cost is studied as fixed ratio and consumption as total pellets, total reinforcers. So here's some illustrative demand functions that have been obtained with rats and food. Okay, so you see the same kind of downward sloping demand function. And so we use these methods to better quantify social reinforcement value. So we just basically ran our social reinforcement methods in this type of arrangement. So we increased the cost, we increased the price, the number of responses that were needed to produce social contact as a reinforcer systematically across sessions, and then looked at how many reinforcers were earned. And you could probably predict, since I'm showing this, that we got the same basic downward sloping function. And one of the advantages of looking at behavior in this way is that you can use quantitative methods then to quantify the value of the social reinforcement. There are certain metrics that are used to quantify the characteristics of the function that tell you important things about the reinforcement value. So these were 6 rats that we studied under these conditions. And these are data that are appearing in an upcoming issue of the Mexican Journal of Behavior Analysis. And I just want to call your attention to this because it's a special issue devoted to the topic of social behavior. And it's coming out, I think, sometime later this year. One other thing I wanted to mention here is that we started out by studying all male rats, but there was something in the original Bartol paper that suggested that female rats were perhaps more socially responsive. And so we studied females, and it turns out that females are so much better at this than males. I mean, females just rock the social release paradigm. And not only did they respond at higher rates, but their behavior is more persistent. So we, in order to better quantify using the demand methods, these are usually done under what are called closed economies, really long sessions where all of the reinforcers are earned within the session. And so we increased our session length from 30 minutes to 2 hours. And you remember that from the, when I described the methods, that this involved manual involvement by the experimenters throughout the session. So I wanted to run like much longer sessions, but these were undergraduates volunteering in the lab, and 2 hours was as much as we could get. The point here is that the females responded throughout the 2-hour session. They responded, and they were still going at the end of the 2-hour session. The males petered out. They couldn't. They didn't even. They couldn't even finish the 2-hour session. So the females are really much better at this than the males. And so from that point on, we've used females. And so from here on out, when I talk about our own data, it'll be with females. So the next thing that we did was I asked, okay, well, if social context serves as a reinforcer, then let's put it into a concurrent arrangement and ask whether they prefer social interaction to no interaction, or social interaction with one rat over another rat. And so the way that this particular procedure worked is that a single press on one lever would produce access to social interaction in the adjacent chamber. Single press on the other lever would produce whatever was in the other chamber, either another rat or an empty chamber, for 45 seconds. And it turns out that rats, they sort of like to explore spaces. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that rats will prefer another rat to an empty chamber. Okay, so that's why we ran this condition as a baseline, as a control. Here's how it works. So this is the target. This is the focal rat. Lever here, lever here. Press on this, opens this door. Press on this lever, opens this door. Okay. So obviously this is the empty chamber. This is the one with the rat. Then we asked whether, and so this shows, and this is a consistent finding, that the rats would prefer the chamber with a rat. Not 100% though, it'd be about 60, 75%, something like that. They would still go into the empty chamber occasionally just to hang out there. But consistently, they would prefer the chamber with the other rat. Then we asked whether they would prefer a rat that was familiar to them, their cage mate, or a stranger rat, an unfamiliar rat. What do you think? What's your prediction? Familiar rat, right? So they prefer their cage mate. Wrong. This is their stranger rat. That's their familiar, that's their cage mate rat. And this turns out to be a very robust finding. We've replicated this in multiple times in different experiments with different rats. They show a consistent preference for an unfamiliar rat over a familiar rat. Now, of course, we run these and using steady state methods, so they're getting lots of exposure to the other rats. So over time, it's not so unfamiliar, but it is the rat that they don't spend a lot of time with otherwise. Okay, so you can probably relate. You've all had roommates that have been, maybe fine to hang out with for a bit, but there are limits, right? So these rats, they tend to prefer the unfamiliar rat over the familiar rat. You may have noticed that in the setup, the rats on the side have a little harness. Okay, so they're tethered to the side here, and the reason that we did that was because otherwise, when the door opens, the rat then jets into the middle, and we wanted to give the focal rat control over the reinforcer, basically to initiate the social interaction and not have the social interaction thrust upon it. And so we developed this technique of tethering the rat over here. They took to it pretty well, and it allowed for relatively normal social interactions, but it also carried with it a few problems. One of my students came in one afternoon and said, the rat is going into the chamber with the other rat, and it's spending all of its time biting at the harness, at the restraint. And I was like, holy cow, maybe the empathy people were right. Maybe he's sensing that this rat is in distress and he's trying to release him. And so I walked to the lab and we watched the session together. And it occurred to me that perhaps the band, the restraint, was the reinforcer. And so what do? Yeah. So we arranged another condition and gave this rat a choice between a rat and the restraint by itself. Okay? So it could, pressing this lever then would open the door and allow the rat access to the restraint that it could then bite and chew on. And rats love to bite and chew on things. So it's feasible that this could function as a reinforcer by itself. There it goes. So a cautionary note. Sometimes when you think you're studying social reinforcement, there are other things that are driving it. So it's really important to pay attention to all of the other things and try to isolate the effects of social reinforcement apart from some of these other confounding variables. And that leads me into a slightly different topic. How we go about assessing social reinforcement in people. And I like this particular method that was described in a paper by Bill Doobie and colleagues in 2004. It's a really brilliant paper on analysis of joint attention. But what I like about it, and we'll talk about joint attention in a bit because it relates to social reinforcement. What I like about this is the method that they used for assessing preference, social preference. They basically, it was like our rats. They set up a space where one side would produce access to certain reinforcers, the other side would produce access to other reinforcers. In this case, there was a bunch of toys and a person that was giving them attention, okay, that was engaging them socially, giving them eye contact, engaged in reciprocal social behavior. On this side, same toys and a person, but the person was not giving them any attention. Okay, so they're looking at this in a social preference in a free operant kind of arrangement, looking at how much time the kid spends in the presence of the adult giving attention versus the adult not giving attention. Everything else is held constant. All of the other toys are the same. Okay. And I really like this method. It's I think it has a lot to recommend it. I couldn't find any further examples of this. They may exist, but these days, people tend to use stimulus preference assessments for assessing the value of social interaction, and these have some advantages as well. And I want to talk about one study that uses this type of stimulus preference assessment to measure social preference in typically developing kids and kids with autism. This is a brilliant paper by Gale and Ikeseth. and colleagues that came out just this year, 2018, I believe. And so, as is well known, the kids with autism tend to prefer non-social over social stimuli. And so this study was designed to assess this. They studied 69 children overall, 28 children with ASD, 41 typically developing kids that were matched. And there was a computerized preference assessment. In the first phase, they measured preference between non-social stimuli like this, geometric shapes, versus human faces, okay? And these are just examples. There was a set of 6 of each, and they were presented randomly. And in a second phase, they tested, they assessed preference for non-social and social non-human. Apparently there is some data suggesting that kids with ASD prefer dogs over people. And so this was an important control to see whether their preference for non-social stimuli was a preference away from human faces, or if it was a general preference for non-social stimuli. And then importantly, in a third phase, they used a progressive ratio schedule. This is kind of the gold standard for assessing reinforcement value. So looking at the stimuli that were identified as reinforcers in the first phase, and then arranging those as contingent on responding in a progressive ratio test. And they tested social and non-social stimuli. And here's what they found. In the non-social versus human case, this is the proportion of non-social. Okay, so this is their preference for the non-social stimuli, and you can see that there is, these are big groups of subjects. These are statistically significant differences. Between ASD, kids with ASD, and typically developing kids. The same basic relationships held for the non-social versus the dog. Okay, so the kids with ASD preferred non-social stimuli to social stimuli, whether they were humans or non-humans. And then importantly, they responded more. They were more persistent on the progressive ratio with non-social stimuli than the typically developing kids. Okay, so I mention this just to illustrate how some newer methods, rigorous methods for assessing social stimuli as reinforcers, that has some relevance to understanding this disorder. Oh, that's what I just said. So the social deficits associated with autism have been known for a long time. This is a passage from Lovaas, 1966. So from the earliest days of a behavioral approach to understanding autism, it was recognized as a disorder of social functioning. And so the question is, are there methods and concepts that we can use to help establish and strengthen social stimuli as reinforcers in this population? And this is not my realm, so I'm not going to talk much about this, but I just want to point you to a couple of really powerful analyses and methods for establishing social interaction, social attention from an adult as a reinforcer. These come from, there are a few, but one of the best, in my opinion, is from Per Holth. In a study by Isaacson and Holth, they used a discriminated operant procedure to establish adult attention as a reinforcer. So their basic analysis was social attention served multiple functions. It served as a reinforcer for the kid's attention and as an SD, a discriminative stimulus for further behavior, which usually was some access to some tangible item. But the crucial thing here is that the adult attention was a necessary part of the chain. Okay, so adult attention got recruited as part of this chain. And they use this as a basis for developing joint attention skills, which are crucial building blocks in verbal behavior. So when attention from others serves important behavioral functions, we can think about it in two different ways. That access to social interaction, engaging with another person, can be thought of as social reinforcement. But this also sets up attention, attending to and engaging with others as important discriminative stimuli. So that's what I want to talk about next. I want to transition from reinforcement functions to discriminative functions. So when social interaction serves reinforcement functions, it does so usually in the context of other stimuli, both social and non-social. So one way we can think about this is social discriminative stimuli can consist of other organisms serving discriminative functions. Okay, so it's just the SD is another organism, another animal, another person. But the more interesting case is where the behavior of another organism serves discriminative functions, where there's differential behavior that is the focus. So let's first talk about other organisms as SDs. There's a great old study published in 1966 that showed that the presence and absence of a rat can serve as a discriminative stimulus. So in this case, pressing the lever produces food in the presence of a rat. And importantly, to establish the rat as an SD, there's also extinction conditions, S delta conditions, where responding doesn't produce food in the absence of that rat. Okay, and they also did follow-up experiments, and this worked, of course. So in the presence of the rat, responding would occur at a high rate. In the absence of the rat, low rate. And they also did this in the presence of different rats. So one rat would be an SD, the other rat would be an S delta. So this shows that another organism can serve important discriminative functions. But it's not really, social in an interesting sense. The other rat, it could just as well have been a tone or a light. There's nothing special about the rat. Is just another stimulus in this arrangement. It's more interesting when the behavior of another organism serves discriminative functions. And this, there's a large literature on this within psychology. It's called observational learning. And this is where the behavior, what others are doing, serves as serves a discriminative function. So the subject has to pay attention to what the model is doing or the demonstrator is doing and match its behavior in some way. So in observational learning, the behavior of another serves as a discriminative stimulus, and importantly, there's some type of correspondence or matching between the behavior of the observer and the observed. This too has been shown to be a deficit in kids with autism, right? And it makes sense when you think about it. When you think about observational learning, it requires paying attention to what others are doing, okay? And so if you don't care about what others are doing, it's observational learning is going to be very difficult. But there are some studies on this of really nice work by Justin Leaf and colleagues on observational learning effects on changing preference patterns in kids with autism. Here's how the procedure worked. In baseline, the kids could choose between different activities, okay? And I'm just making this up. I don't remember exactly what they used, but let's say interacting with a ball and playing with clay. They preferred the clay. Then they go to this observational phase where a preferred adult, and they did a preference assessment to identify a preferred adult. A preferred adult played with the less preferred items. Okay, so spent time interacting happily with, in this case, with the balls. Okay, and talked about how great these balls were to play with, and so on. And then they returned to the choice, and they gave the kids choice between the different reinforcers. And what they found was that the previously less preferred items now were preferred as a function of observing this person, this preferred person, interact happily with objects. So the preferences were altered in a way that was consistent with the model. So this is pretty cool. They were able to show this. What's unclear is the controlling variables. What was responsible for that shift in preference? What aspect of that manipulation really was relevant? So one possibility they considered was that the person had become a conditioned reinforcer, and just interacting with the toys then transferred the reinforcement value from the person to the toy. Okay, that's possible. Another possibility is that watching the other person interact with the toy simply facilitated contact with that toy. Okay, so maybe the kid's like, okay, well, maybe the ball became more salient. And then the kid approached the ball and started interacting with the ball, and that produced its own consequences. Okay? Do you see the difference between the two? So in one, the ball actually has some reinforcement value that's been imbued. In the other case, the intervention has simply called attention to the ball as a possible thing to play with, and then the kid interacted with it, produced its own consequences. Why should this matter? Well, I think it's important to understand what it is that's controlling behavior, and this is where the comparative animal behavior literature is useful, because this has been something that's been studied in animals for a long time, And people in this realm make various distinctions between different subtypes of observational learning. Talk about social facilitation, social enhancement, and imitation as different types of observational learning. So social facilitation describes a situation where the mere presence of another organism changes your behavior. This was first studied in an athletic context. This is an old study showing that the presence of others altered the performance. And of course, there are countless examples of this in our everyday life. Just having somebody else in your presence alters what you do. Okay, it's not really imitation. You're not matching your behavior necessarily to theirs. It's simply the presence of another alters what you do. So there are examples of this, and another example is eating. Studies have shown that that people will eat for longer periods of time and will eat more food in the presence of others than if they're eating alone. Okay, this has been shown with other animals as well. So it's a special case where there are changes in behavior that are driven by the presence of others, but is this really observational learning per se, or is it simply what some people call social facilitation? It's particularly difficult to sort these out when the other behavior is similar. Okay, if we're like eating, social facilitation of eating, it's really difficult to separate social facilitation from observational learning because the behavior also looks similar. Related to this is something that comparative psychologists call social enhancement. And this is where the presence of others evokes behavior toward an object or a location that then produces its own consequences. Okay, so this also is a type of observational learning. You're learning about some object or about some location, but then your behavior is drawn into contact with that, and it produces its own consequences. So why is this important? Well, if we think about the LEAF study, which I think is a brilliant study in many ways, we don't know what the controlling variables are. We don't know if it's value transfer from the preferred human to the object, or whether it's simply social enhancement, whether interacting with that toy draws attention to it and it produces then its own consequences. This is more than just a theoretical interest. It has practical significance, I think, because think about how you would go about testing that. If it's value transfer, if the object has been imbued with reinforcement value, then you would think that continued pairing would be important. Okay? If it's simply social enhancement, that is, that this object has become more salient, then all it's going to take is that initial contact, because thereafter, the social consequences are irrelevant, right? After that, it's just simply the consequences that result from interacting with the toy, okay? So this could be explored experimentally, and we could determine which of those is actually the controlling variable. And of course, thinking about these two procedures, it has some practical significance, because one is going to be much easier to implement than the other. If it's simply social enhancement, then all you're going to have to do is bring behavior into contact with that object and then let it go. If it's pairing, if it's value transfer, then you're going to have to repeatedly pair with that preferred human in order to maintain its reinforcement value. Okay? So this is a case where understanding the controlling variables has some real practical significance. Okay, the last type of observational learning is imitation. And imitation is a special case where the response topography matches. Okay, so there's some direct correspondence between the model and the observer. It was once thought that imitation was unique to people. But we now know, and this is not that long ago, it's only been in the last 20 or 25 years that, that we've started to understand the degree to which imitation is seen across species. And here's a partial list of species in which imitation has been empirically demonstrated. So it's a very reliable phenomenon. Here's some of the variables that are known to affect imitation in animals. Reinforcement for the demonstrator. Okay, so seeing for the observer, the imitator, to see the imitatee actually receive reinforcement. This turns out to be key. The motivation for the demonstrator, they have to be responding under conditions where the reinforcer is valuable. The delay between when the model is seen and when the action is performed, the imitated action, as well as the familiarity between the subjects. So we know quite a lot now about the variables related to imitation in non-humans. These also apply to humans, but there are some important differences. So for one, there's a vast difference in complexity, in the complexity of the imitated act. It's far more complex in people than in non-people. The most important difference is specific versus generalized imitation. In people, really from an early age, imitation emerges as a generalized response class. This is generalized imitation. So once you have sufficient experience with particular imitated actions, then what gets established is a generalized class. So then you can imitate a wide range of other behaviors. With non-humans, it's pretty much restricted to specific types of imitation. We don't see generalized imitation. We don't see imitation as a generalized class in non-humans. With one exception, and that is apes who have lived in captivity, who have lived with humans. These are so-called enculturated apes, in research projects, or this is from Terrace's research project, movies. Okay, so chimps have a long history of living with people. There is some evidence that these types of chimps have learned some generalized imitation. Okay, but again, this comes from the human social environment. Now, on the topic of differences between humans and non-humans on imitation, I want to show you a video to illustrate this. Nope. Display. There we go. This is about 3.5 minutes.
Which are uniquely our own. We have any mental skills which are uniquely our own. A key clue comes from a new experiment. Back at the University of Texas, Victoria Horner shows a chimp how to operate a puzzle box to get a treat. First she taps, then she slots. Next, she pokes. The chimp copies fairly well and gets the sweet.
This game we're gonna play is about this special box I brought, all right? There's a gummy bear. It's your turn.
Children copy the actions much as the chimps did.
Oh, you got him. All right, there's a gummy bear. Good job.
The second box that I show the chimpanzees is this one, and it's identical to the opaque box, except that it's made out of material which is see-through.
Only now is it obvious that the tapping and poking don't achieve a thing. The box has a false ceiling. The chimps cut to the chase. They skip the needless steps. For the apes, it is all about the treat.
What this study shows is that apes don't just mindlessly ape. They also understand something more about cause and effect.
We found something quite surprising. The children were predisposed to copy, even when it meant that they were doing something that was really rather silly. So this seems a little like the chimps are outsmarting the kids in this particular study.
There he is. You got him out.
Why do children imitate slavishly?
At the root of the children's behaviour is the fact that they view me as a grown-up, possibly as a teacher.
That children expect to be taught is a vital difference. While apes can copy, most researchers believe that they do not teach each other.
So what do you think of that? Pretty interesting, huh? So we think about, am I still on? Yeah. I'm just going to close this for now. So we think about imitation, especially generalized imitation, as being something. Closed my computer. What is happening? Okay. I'll just leave it there. So we think about imitation as being a very higher order behavioral skill. And in fact, it is. Generalized imitation is something that enables us to learn new things very quickly, and it's responsible for great human achievements. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Our strong engagement with others, our standing tendency to imitate what others are doing can also get us into trouble. It can also lead to counterproductive outcomes. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as we think about some of the differences between humans and other animals. There are situations in which our supercharged social skills get us into trouble. It makes us susceptible to control by authority figures, to imitating things that are counterproductive and potentially destructive. Okay.
When I saw that, it occurred to me was how much it looks like the difference between contingency-shaped behavior and verbally governed behavior. There's no verbal stuff in what the children were doing, but the relationship between what the children were doing and what the teacher was doing.
You're getting a mic, Charlie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, okay. When I saw that, I was reminded of what we see as the difference between contingency-shaped behavior with, say, children and verbally governed behavior, except that in that example there was no verbal stuff, but there was still a relationship between a teacher and the student in which, and in lots of that stuff, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, those kinds of contingencies override the nonverbal contingencies. So I wonder whether you have anything to say about that analogy.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's actually when, early in development, when social behavior gives rise to, I think, joint attention and other kinds of foundational social building blocks give rise to verbal skills, it becomes almost impossible to disentangle verbal and social. And the way that I think about it is that all verbal behavior is social, but not all social behavior is verbal. And so I think that the rudiments, the building blocks of imitation are in social, nonverbal behavior, but in developing verbal repertoires, then they become intertwined early on. And that's where I think it's important to understand social behavior in other animals. So to the extent that other animals are nonverbal, we're seeing pure social behavior. The piece of it that is non-human and non-verbal.
Thank you. I like it.
This seems like a good time to take a break. So why don't we take a 15-minute break and then we'll reconvene. Okay, folks, let's get restarted. So looking back on our functional analysis to our basic definition of social behavior, we've been focusing on the Keller and Schoenfeld part of the definition, where the behavior of others serves important behavioral functions, either discriminative stimuli or reinforcers. And what I want to do next, and for the remainder of our time, is focus on the Skinner part of the definition that has to do with the interdependent contingencies. Okay, so the one important type of interdependent contingency is one where two or more organisms work together to achieve some common end, or what is referred to as cooperation. Okay, so this is one of the defining features of cooperation is that this behavior that produces benefits for another. Okay, so this is often called pro-social behavior. Okay, behavior that produces benefits for another individual. Why is this important? Well, it should be obvious that cooperation is something that is pervasive in human behavior. and it's often regarded as one of the foundational building blocks for human culture. This ability to work together to achieve some common end or some common reinforcer. It's also important for theoretical reasons because it challenges cost-benefit models, strict literal application of cost-benefit models of behavior. By cost-benefit, I mean any type of model that's based on individual self-interest. Okay, so in evolution, in economics, whether the costs and benefits are specified as gains and losses, whether they're specified as reinforcers. The providing benefits for another challenges these models that are based on individual self-interest. Okay? Does this make sense? Okay. So understanding the basics of cooperation is extremely important both for practical, conceptual, and theoretical reasons. So in cooperation, cooperation is one end of a continuum that also includes competition. Okay, so interdependent contingencies we can think of as existing on this continuum, where on one end you have pro-social behavior, where behavior produces benefits for another organism, and at the other end, competition, where behavior reduces the benefits for another. Okay, so you can think about on the cooperation end, the individual is engaging in behavior at some cost to itself to produce benefits for another. At the other end, in competition, the individual is producing benefits for itself at the expense of another. And so these are often regarded as two separate domains, but I tend to think about them as existing on a continuum. And a subtle change in the contingencies can flip behavior from cooperative to competitive. But just for the purposes of organization, I'm going to cover these separately, cooperation, and then we'll hit competition. So one way to approach the problem of cooperation, one of the mechanisms that has been proposed to account for cooperation is called mutualism. And this is where two or more organisms work together to produce mutual benefits for both of them. Okay, so this is seen widely in the animal kingdom. It's seen in cooperative hunting. It's seen in cooperative territory defense. It's seen in cooperative niche construction, where animals will work together to produce benefits for that each of them receives. This has been studied in the lab for a long time. This dates back to a procedure that was introduced by Crawford in 1937. And in this basic procedure, mutual pulling of a tray of food produced food for two chimps. Okay? So the way that it worked was both of them had to synchronize and coordinate their behavior in order to pull this tray of food within reach. Turns out chimps are not very good at this. They're just not very good at it, but the procedure caught on, and it's been used in dozens of studies since then, including with elephants, same basic task, and hyenas, among other species. And so the basic procedure is adapted to the particular anatomy and characteristics of the species under study, but the same basic task involves coordinated behavior that produces mutually beneficial outcomes. So you can see that this doesn't challenge cost-benefit models, because here the animal, yes, is behaving for the benefit of another, but it's getting something in return. Okay, so it can behave selfishly while at the same time producing benefits for another organism. We've studied this in my rat lab using an apparatus like this, two adjacent experimental chambers, here and here, each equipped with a lever, each with its own food dispenser. Okay? And in the basic procedure, two rats have to coordinate their behavior. They have to respond at pretty much the same time, within a half second of the other rat, to produce food for both of them. Okay? So in this case, mutual reinforcement is the food that's presented to both rats for lever presses that occur less than half second apart. So you can think about this as an inner response time, or an IRT. Now normally IRTs are units that are appropriate to the behavior of individual organisms. But here, what we've done is arranged a social IRT. Okay, so one rat starts the IRT, the other rat terminates it. Does that make sense? So one rat responds, the other rat that responds within a half second then produces food for both of them. And we also ran some control procedures to show that it was actually the mutual reinforcement contingency that was driving the behavior, and not simply the frequency of reinforcement. So we arranged for the same frequency of reinforcement from the mutual reinforcement conditions where coordinated responding was required. We just presented that food freely to see if that was a factor. And we also arranged a second type of control in which the responding of the time between food deliveries was yoked as a VI, a variable interval schedule. So the responding of one of the rats that satisfied the VI would produce food for both of them. Does that make sense? So here, both a response was required, food occurred at the same frequency, but what was lacking was the mutual reinforcement contingency requiring social coordination. And here's some data. This shows the proportion of the coordinated responses over the total responses for 3 different rats represented by the 3 different colors. Here is the baseline where a mutual reinforcement contingency was in place. This required the coordinated responding. Here, here, and here. These are all the same conditions. These are mutual reinforcement conditions. These are the yoked control conditions. So the results show clearly that only in the conditions requiring coordinated behavior did it happen. Okay, when it wasn't required, as in here, responding was required, but social coordinated responding was not. It dropped down. Here are the data presented in a different way for 2 of the rats. This shows, these are IRT distributions. So what we have here is frequency. These are different IRT bins, okay? For 2 rats, boy, the shading didn't turn out very well, but this is the shaded region. This is the target region with the social IRT less than half a second here and here. And these, so this is the data from the mutual reinforcement conditions where the IRTs conform to the reinforced class. And the reason I like showing, sorry, I'm having trouble with my pointer. The reason I like showing the data in this way is because it really highlights this unit, that there's the social IRT as the unit of analysis for coordinated behavior. And if you think about it, this, whenever there's a mutual reinforcement contingency, there has to be some common behavior, some behavior that both of the rats engage in. And I'm particularly interested in identifying these fundamental units that can be applied across different preparations. So I don't have time to go into more detail on this, but we did run some other conditions to try to track down the sources of stimulus control and and how flexible behavior was, how it adapted to new social partners. But I'm not going to talk about those in the interest of time, but I would just direct you to a paper that includes these data, a paper that we published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Comparative Psychology on this mutual reinforcement contingency. This basic procedure requiring coordinated behavior is related to an old study with humans by Azrin and Lindsley. And in this study, I love the schematic. These were kids that were seated at a table with a barrier separating them, and the task was to take a device and insert it into a hole at the same time as the other kid. Okay, so it's a mutual reinforcement contingency requiring this socially coordinated behavior. And this would produce some candy. Coordinated responding developed in most of the kids, I think in 8 of the 10 pairs of kids. In the 2 where it broke down, there was an inequity in the distribution of the reinforcers. So instead of delivering the reinforcers separately, as we did for our rats, they delivered the reinforcers, the candy, into a common receptacle. And then the kids had to decide how to allocate them. And most of the kids, 8 of the 10 pairs, the ones in whom coordinated responding developed, divided the share equitably. The other 2 didn't, and that's when it broke down. Okay, so when one kid took a larger share of the pie, the other kid stopped cooperating, and cooperation broke down. And it turns out that this variable, the relationship between the earnings for the different subjects, turns out to be a key variable in human studies. It's called inequity, sensitivity to inequitable distributions. This was first studied experimentally in an old study published in 1974 by Vukolich and Haig. And I just want to say a couple of things. In preparing for this presentation, I went back and reread some of these old experimental studies on social behavior, and they are fantastic. They're really, they're rigorous, they're really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. And it's a shame that that these are not, that this work was not pursued, because I think that it was really, really important. So a couple of the main labs that were studying this, one is Don Hake's lab in the 70s and 80s. Don Hake unfortunately died an untimely death. I think he was in his 50s at the time. And this work ceased. There's another line of research that took place at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with Charlie and some of his colleagues, Byron Matthews in particular, a behaviorally oriented social psychologist, did some fantastic work, as well as David Schmidt, who was at the University of Washington. Those three labs really accounted for most of the experimental social work. And I don't have time to cover all of this, but I am going to feature work from each of those labs and encourage you, if you're interested, to go back and look at some of these seminal studies, because they're really terrific. So in this particular experiment by Vukolich and Hake, they're interested in something they called social auditing. And so they recognized that inequity was something that was really important in maintaining cooperative behavior. And so they developed a procedure for studying, they called it auditing, which is basically making a response to produce feedback for oneself and for the other. Okay? So in other words, the individual subjects could monitor the earnings for the other, okay, involved in this kind of coordinated behavior. The auditing response didn't produce any reinforcement directly. So this was an option that was added to the target response. And it didn't provide any reinforcement. It just provided feedback on the other's earning and one's own earning, one's own earnings. So in this experiment, they studied behavior under a match-to-sample task, and they allowed for, or they included this auditing option. So a response would provide feedback on your own points and points that the other person was getting. And then they manipulated the inequity by I think what they did was they arranged for a different rate of problems, match-to-sample problems for the two subjects. So one got access to opportunities to earn more reinforcers than the other. And it turns out that self-audits didn't occur very much, occasionally, but other audits were the most important. So people really wanted to know how much the other person was getting, so they could monitor the degree of equity. And it turns out that, and this turns out to be a very reliable finding, that the auditing is highest when the inequity is low. Okay, when the earnings are closest, that's when people most value information on what their partner is getting. And it was lowest when the inequities were high. So when there was wide disparities in the earnings, people didn't care so much about what the other person was getting. And this might be because it's aversive to know how much the other person is getting if they're getting a lot more than you are. The other thing I really like about this study is they identified a unit which they called the interpersonal audit. So what they found was people didn't just sort of occasionally check to see what the other one was getting. What they did was they would engage in this kind of coordinated behavior where they would check and then the other person would check immediately. And so they were monitoring very closely what the other person was getting. So they defined what they called an interpersonal audit. This is the behavior of both of the subjects that occurred in close temporal contiguity, so within a half second of each other. And this, again, is what I want to regard as a kind of fundamental functional social unit. And even though it didn't produce reinforcement on its own, it emerged as this reliable finding. So we'll come back to this a little bit later, but this inequity turns out to be crucial in human cooperation and competition experiments. By the way, this is an area in which there seems to be a break between human and non-human. Non-humans don't care. They just don't care about whether the situation is fair, whether it's equitable. What they care about is getting their own thing. They're not much concerned with how fairly or unfairly they're being treated in the sense of a disparity from what their partner is getting. So think about that and what might be responsible for that. I want to move next to a different type of cooperation. This is sometimes called resource sharing or resource exchange. And this turns out to be more challenging for the sort of cost-benefit models, whether we're talking about fitness-related variables or maximization or reinforcement. With resource exchange, you're giving or sharing resources with another organism. Okay? And what seems to be important in maintaining this type of sharing is that you get it in return. Okay, there's some kind of reciprocity. So you give it up, but there's some contingency whereby you get something back. Okay, and this seems to be crucial. But the reason this is a challenge for literal cost-benefit models is, why would you ever give something up that costs you? Why would you ever give something up? Well, one explanation is rooted in biology. It's called kin selection. And the idea here is that you share resources, you give something up to your close relatives. Okay? And so with the idea is that you share genes with your close relatives. And so giving something up can be explained in terms of passing on your genes to the next generation. So this involves a mechanism called inclusive fitness. Now it turns out that with animals at least, most of this type of sharing does occur with close relatives, genetic relatives. But there are lots of examples, even in the animal kingdom, of sharing with non-relatives. So this can't be explained by simple models of kin selection. So we have to appeal to behavioral mechanisms that play out within the individual's lifetime. And the main behavioral mechanism is one called reciprocity. Okay, so this is something that I alluded to just a moment ago, that you're giving something up now, but you get returns later. This is what some in the field call correlated payoffs. This is a recent theoretical paper by Michael Taborski, who does really first-rate work in the area of pro-social behavior in animals. And the idea here is that this kind of pro-social behavior develops when the correlated payoffs are salient, when you are giving something up, but you're getting something in return. So there are different types of reciprocity. The first type, and probably the most straightforward to understand, is called direct reciprocity. And that's where you help those who have helped you. Okay, this is a kind of direct, reciprocal, tit for tat, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back type of arrangement, where you share resources with a particular individual that has given you resources in the past. We've studied this in my lab using the same apparatus I showed you a bit earlier, but unlike the earlier situation where coordinated responding of two rats produced food for both of them, in this arrangement, one rat produces food for the other rat produces food for the first rat. So rats produce food only for their partner and never directly for themselves. So it works like this. Rat A presses a lever, produces food for rat B. Rat B presses a lever, produces food for rat A. Okay? And once that is established under FR1 schedules, where a single press produces a single reinforcer, it alternates, then we increase the length of the components, the reciprocal components, or the exchange intervals, so that it requires more and more responses to produce food for the other. No, sorry, I said that wrong. Where the giving period is increased before the exchange occurs. Okay, so they have to make more and more responses before they get anything back. And so we decided just to see if we could get this to work, and then once we got it established, we just pushed it. We just extended it until it broke down. And so you can imagine the rats having to engage in a kind of trusting behavior, right? Because you're giving up responses, at a cost to the individual, to your partner, and we're increasing the amount of charity work that you're doing before you get anything in return. So these are the data for 3 pairs of rats. This shows the number of reciprocal responses across sessions, and the different colored bars within each plot show the number of responses for each of the subjects within the pair. Okay, and so for these 2 pairs, they were able to maintain this kind of reciprocal give and take until the components got up to about 12. Okay, so they were, under these conditions, giving 12 food deliveries for the other rat before they would get anything in return. And then it eventually broke down. And it broke down when one of them stopped, when the receiver stopped giving, and then the whole the whole social behavior broke down. In this pair, they were crazy. They went all the way up to 24, and we just gave up at that point. They were continuing to engage in this kind of reciprocal interaction all the way up until 24 cycles had passed before getting anything in return.
Were these familiar to each other?
They were, yes. Yeah, they were cage mates. It's a good question, though, and we thought about looking at how if that would adapt to new social partners. We did find that in the social coordination case, and so I'm pretty confident that it would hold up once the basic kind of behavior is established. So this is what we call direct reciprocity, as I said, where the giver and receiver are, have a history with each other. There is another type of reciprocity. It's called indirect reciprocity, where animals will help others who have helped. Okay, not necessarily them, but they're more inclined to help animals who have generally been helpful to other animals. This is sometimes called reputation-based reciprocity, and it's seen with people and also with in some animals. There's also a very interesting type of reciprocity that's called generalized reciprocity, and this is conforms to the rule: help if you have been helped. Okay, so if you've been helped, this produces a general tendency to help others, even if those others have not helped you directly in the past. Sometimes it's called upstream reciprocity. Did you have a question?
Is that the idea of pay it forward?
Yes, exactly. So, so this is, we can think of examples of this in the human realm, but it's also been seen with animals. And in one really ingenious experiment by Taborski and his colleagues, they studied generalized reciprocity in rats in the following way. They had two rats, one they called a focal rat, and one was the partner. Okay? They had this tray with food available here, so it was similar to the kind of arrangement that I described earlier, where animals had to pull a tray within reach to get food for both. Okay? But in this case, only one of them got fed. Only one of them got fed. And this is the one that had control over the tray. And so they were asking, under what conditions would this rat produce food solely for this rat? Okay? And they didn't have a kind of reciprocal contingency like we did in our research. This rat was the puller, was the donor for the entire session. This rat was the receiver for the entire session. Yes?
Did the rats see each other?
Yes, they could see each other. They could see each other. And it turns out that, and they did this, and they do this, but it turns out that the rats with a history of being helped were much more likely to engage in this kind of pro-social behavior. So, and they manipulated this history of help. So this focal rat here either had been helped previously by other rats, that is, had been given food, or not. And that history of being helped then increased the likelihood that they would themselves help. So this is a relatively simple and straightforward case of what the authors call generalized reciprocity. Okay, so this provides a kind of mechanism by which this type of resource sharing occurs. And so just to kind of sum up what we know about this type of resource sharing in animals, it tends to occur when the cost of the individual, sometimes called the donor, are low. Okay, so it's not going to be resistant to big changes in the cost or the price. When they're relatively low, it doesn't cost you too much to give. When the benefits to the other are high, okay, so when either when the amount that you're giving to the other is high, they've also manipulated the need level of the other animal by depriving it of food. And it turns out that rats are sensitive to this, so they're more likely to help animals that are more food restricted than others. So when the benefits to the other are high. And importantly, when there are frequent opportunities for reciprocal behavior. So this turns out to be an important variable. And the correlated payoffs, the give and take, are salient. So this is what we know about resource exchange with animals. With people, all of these same variables are relevant, plus when the inequity is low, okay? So this kind of behavior breaks down if the disparity in the earnings, the disparity in the resources between the subjects gets too high. So it's critical that the inequity variable is minimal. This was studied experimentally in a very clever experiment by Byron Matthews, who I mentioned earlier. He was interested in something called exchange expansion. The number of responses, the amount of work that one would do before getting anything in return. Okay, this is the exchange, the intervals between reinforcers for the individual. And he wanted to call this, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about trust, because when you are giving up opportunities to earn reinforcers for yourself, you're giving those to another person, you are in a sense trusting that you're going to get something in return at some point, okay? Because again, the basic mechanism is reciprocity. You've got to get something in return. All types of cooperation turns out to be conditional. It's conditional upon the individual getting something back. So here's how the procedure works. It's a very interesting procedure. It's a choice. And this is one of the things that characterizes much of this early experimental work. They arranged concurrent schedules, usually with a social option and a non-social option. So the subjects could choose, do I want to engage socially or not? And they had different payoffs associated with those. In this particular experiment, the non-social or individual payoffs were smaller than the social, what they called the exchange payoffs, giving up reinforcers for the other, giving up opportunities to earn reinforcers for oneself. So they would get 4 cents for engaging in the non-social option, 10 cents for engaging in the social option. But the 10 cents was risky, right? Because they had to trust that the other person was going to then return the favor and give them opportunities to earn their own reinforcers. So we can think about this in a way as a trade-off between the amount of reinforcement and the probability of reinforcement. What's the probability that you're going to get something in return? And then what they manipulated was the number of trials separating the reinforcers. So this is a bit complicated, so let me walk you through it. What they found in general, all else equal, is that the subjects like to maintain small exchanges. So they would, this reduced the inequity, it reduced the cheating, the disproportionate earnings by one subject over the other, so they preferred to engage in this kind of tit for tat. I'll take one, you take one. When they introduced a contingency to make that exchange option a bit costlier, the greater inequity was tolerated. So they would allow the other one to earn lots of reinforcers before it would swing back to them. Okay? And this built up gradually, slowly over time. This trust built up gradually over time. But then they introduced an interesting variation on the procedure where the session length became unpredictable. So in these here, so this is without any cost to the exchange. Here's where they introduced cost to the exchange, and they were able to tolerate these big inequities. but they knew how long the session was. So they knew sort of, at what point they could try to swing it back to themselves. Then they made the sessions unpredictable. And then what happened? It broke down. So they stopped tolerating these large inequities and went back to this kind of reciprocal exchange, tit for tat exchange. So what I take from this is, yes, trust, but verify. You've got to have some kind of guarantee that you're going to get something in return. And when you throw that into flux with an unpredictable session duration, then it breaks down. Because you might be giving, and you might not get because the session ends.
Is that a different kind of cooperation? Like, we're both going to do this to the top so that we don't end up with a situation where one person has so much and the other person has so little? Like, I mean, is that fair to call that a breakdown? Or is that just like a different kind of cooperation?
It's a different. Yes. Where's the mic?
I can say it louder, I think.
It's for the live stream. That.
Oh, yes, okay. Sorry.
Apologies for interrupting.
No.
Is
I
it
welcome interruptions.
is it fair to characterize it as a breakdown, or could you also conceptualize it as a different kind of cooperation? So if both parties don't know when the session is going to end, perhaps neither wants to earn more than the other necessarily, and so you go back to this brief bouts of reciprocal earning so that you don't end up with one person getting much more than the other with the unpredictable session length.
Yes, I think that's right. But I think what's driving it is the reinforcers for the individual. So the minimizing the inequity is the outcome, but I think what's driving it is that each individual is worried that they're not going to get their share. They're going to give up more than their share because of they don't know how long that session's going to last. And so I think that, yes, the inequity, minimizing the inequity is the outcome, but I think it's the individual contingencies that are driving it. Does that make sense? So here's an interim summary of what we know about cooperation from this point of view. It's a complex function of many interacting variables. It's really complicated, but these are the things that we know are important. Cost to the individual, benefits to the other, the availability of non-cooperative alternatives, frequent opportunities for reciprocal behavior, feedback for self and others, and inequity in earnings. So we actually do know kind of a lot about this. It's a very, very complex phenomenon, but these are variables known to be relevant. Many of these same variables are also relevant to competition, and this is what I want to talk about next. So we can think about competition as describing situations where reinforcement is divided unequally depending on individual performance. This is sort of the operational definition. And this is behavior that produces benefits for oneself at the expense of another. And so the conditions under which people will cooperate and compete really depend on these kinds of interacting variables. People are not, always pro-social. They're not always cooperative. They're not always competitive. It really just depends on the contingencies. And there's some really nice work that's been done along these lines. want to talk about that. No, I'm gonna skip over that and get to this. So this is a paper by David Schmidt that arranged for cooperative contingencies in a human operant lab. And the way that the procedure worked is that the session was divided into these 2-minute contests, they call them, where the payoff depended on a number of responses. So the two subjects were competing with each other for a single reinforcer available at the end of the 2 minutes. The highest response rate won, okay? And so one's gains come at the expense of the other subject. And what they manipulated, one of the things they manipulated was what they called the payoff contingencies. So in some cases, it was all or none. So the one that had the highest response rate would get all of the reinforcer. In other cases, they made it 2/3. So the one that got the highest got 2/3 of the points, and the one that had the lowest response rate got 1/3 of the points. And in other cases, they made the payoffs proportional to the response rates. So they would divide the reinforcer by the difference between the two response rates. Interestingly, they also had something they called an escape option. And this was a second option. The subjects could select any time during that 2-minute interval before it elapsed that would terminate the trial and produce less reinforcement for both of them, but equal but less than they could earn in the competitive arrangement. Which do you think produced the highest rate of competition? Which of the 3 payment contingencies? Think about it. One where you've got, it's all or none. One person gets it all or nothing. The other person gets nothing. One where it's a bit more graded, and another one where it's proportional. What's going to maintain the highest response rates for both subjects? Proportional, right, exactly. You guys are smart. The proportional response rates maintained the highest rates of competitive, the proportional contingency maintained the highest rates of competitive behavior. And interestingly, escape was highest with greater discrepancies in the earnings. So think about that. So the subjects continued to respond in this competitive way as long as they still had some chance of winning. They still had some chance of getting reinforcement. But as the discrepancy in the earnings increased over this 2-minute interval, and it became increasingly clear that the lower response rate subject was not going to get as much, what did they do? Terminated the trial and screwed the other person, basically. The one that was subject to a higher rate of reinforcement, who had that coming, they would terminate the trial and produce a low rate of reinforcement for both of them, a low but equal rate of reinforcement for both of them. Have you ever done this? Where you would, and mind you, that this came at a cost to the individual who was engaged in the escape, because they're getting a lower rate of reinforcement that would have been available, except, in most cases, it was a costly response. They're actually reducing their rate of reinforcement in order to to minimize the discrepancy in the earnings. Okay, so like cooperation, competition is a complex function of many interacting variables, including all the ones that we talked about before with competition, with cooperation, but also a few that are specific to competition. One, the presence of non-competitive alternatives. This turns out to be important. The criteria for evaluating or ranking performance. This is crucial to competitive contingency. You have to have some means of differentiating the performance of two or more subjects, and the relative reinforcer distribution, whether it's fixed or proportional. I want to move on next to an area that is sometimes called social decision-making or social preferences. These are, unlike most of what we've talked about today that have used kind of standard behavior analytic methods, this is an area that, doesn't use behavior analytic methods, but it is one of the fastest growing research areas in all of social and behavioral sciences. And in behavioral economics and social psychology, and it includes things that I call, these are social economic games, sometimes called matrix games. So it includes things like the prisoner's dilemma, public goods game, the ultimatum game, and things like this. And I just want to touch on this in the interest of comprehensiveness. I want to just throw this out there. And think about this from a behavior analytic point of view, what is going on here. I want to talk about one of these games called the ultimatum game. Has anybody ever heard of this? Yeah? Okay. This is the way it works. There are two players in the ultimatum game. One is called the proposer, and the other is called the responder. And the proposer is given some sum of money. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's hypothetical. It doesn't seem to matter a great deal. The basic findings are very reliable. So the proposer proposes a certain breakdown of money, a certain allocation. So I might say, for example, of these $10, I'll take 8 and you take 2. Might say, I'll take 5, you take 5, okay? So all of the options are available. And the responder then decides whether to accept the offer, in which case they both get paid, whatever is specified in the proposal, or can reject, and neither of them get paid. Okay? So think about it. What's the optimal thing to do for the responder? Always accept. Any non-zero offer should be accepted by the responder, right? So this is the optimal solution to this problem. Why would you ever give up money if you had an opportunity to get at least something? Yeah? This is not what happens. This is not what happens. Think about yourself in this situation. You're the responder. And you can see that the proposer can give you any allocation of this $10. And they only give you 2, and they take 8 for themselves. Are you going to accept that or reject it? Can you think of conditions under which you might reject that? Yeah, lots of people do. Turns out that the proposer typically makes offers that are about 40 to 50%. Okay, so not always strictly equitable, but somewhere around there. And any offers that are 30% or less tend to be rejected. Okay? Why? Why do they reject them? Yes?
Does this tie back into the inequity part that we kind of talked about earlier?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Say more about that.
So, I mean, I would feel like you would rather have both of you have nothing than somebody else have way more than you.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. So, oh, I'm sorry, the mic. So the question is, does this tie back into the inequity thing that we talked about before? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So this is offered as evidence of this sensitivity to inequity or sensitivity to unfairness. So people reject what they consider to be unfair offers. It's important to underscore this point that this is decidedly non-optimal, to take nothing for yourself in order to punish another for an unfair offer. This also illustrates something that is common in these general types of experiments, not just the ultimatum game, but in some of the other social economic games, that people are willing to punish any sort of cheaters or unfair actors. Okay, so this obviously depends on a history prior to the experiment that they're tapping into, but this seems to be a fairly general sort of finding. So here's a schematic describing a set of conditions in something called a mini ultimatum game. So in the general ultimatum game, you're just given a sum, you can split it up any way you want. In this variation, they play a series of different games with different payoffs. So in the 5-to-5 game, and I should say also that the proposer always proposes either 8-to-2, taking 8 for themselves, giving 2 to the responder, versus this. And the responder knows what the context is. So the responder knows that the proposer either can give them 5-5, an equal split, or 8-to-2. Okay, and that's crucial for understanding the results. They know what the alternative is. So when, and in this case, this is considered unfair. This is considered fair, right? Or actually sometimes called hyper-fair, because the proposer is either 8-to-2 or is only taking 2 and giving 8. 8-to-2 equal or 10-0. What do you predict generates the highest percentage of rejections? What do you predict? Remember that you are the responder here. You know what the proposer, the options that are available to the proposer. So you're either, do you accept the 8-to-2 offer in the context of a fair offer, 5-5, 8-to-2 in the context of a fair offer? What do you think? What do you predict is the highest? What would you do if you were the responder? Or does it matter? Any guesses? Yes?
I have a question. Is there opportunities for more trials in it, though, or is this only one offer? Like, will I possibly get another offer of 8 versus 2 and 5 versus 5?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I would possibly?
Yes. So the question is, are these iterated trials? And the answer is yes. Not always, but in some cases, yes. It turns out that people are most likely to reject under these conditions when the alternative is fair, when they know that the person can split things up fairly and they don't. okay? Unless, fewest rejections here. Do you see why? Here, the 8-to-2 offer occurs in the context of a 10-to-0 offer. So here, the responder is going, oh, they're being generous with 8-to-2 because the alternative is 10-0, right? So these are data from a seminal study by Falk and colleagues showing the rejection rate across these different payoff matrices. 5, 5, 2, 8, 8-to-2, 10. So what the authors want to suggest here is that this represents or reflects both a sensitivity to fairness and what they call the intention of the proposer, okay? What we would call the context, okay? The available choices, the choices available to the proposer. But they want to say is that somehow it's not just about the differential payoffs, it's about what the alternatives are. So it's the differential payoffs in context. What do you think animals do? What do you think chimps do on these games? Remember what I told you before about chimps? Yes?
They accept everything.
Yes. So the response here is they accept everything, and that's absolutely right. They accept everything. So the filled bars are the chimp data. So the chimps accept everything. This turns out to be the optimal strategy, right? They don't care about whether this is what the other chimp in this case is giving them, as long as they're getting something each trial. Yes.
The repeated measures question brings up another dimension to consider about optimization, because if my response on an unfair offer changes the likelihood that you'll give me fair offers or generous offers in the future, then maybe initially, like I don't optimize that particular trial, but I optimize my earnings overall by setting the standards for what I will accept.
Yes, I mean, yes, I see what you're saying. Yes, the history matters definitely, and that turns out to be one of the things that that maintains that intermediate level of giving, of proposing, because the proposers are not acting altruistically to give. They're worried that if their offer is too low, the other person will punish and they won't get anything in return. And I'm not sure what to say about that, about because some of these are run as single shot choices and some are run in an iterated format. So it's a really good point. I just don't know. I just don't know the answer to that.
Perhaps if you think about it as humans, even if they're only, if it's a one-shot trial with this particular experiment, they're going to encounter parallel situations like this in other contexts in their lives. And so if they have been willing to accept less in one setting, then that becomes a generalized operant, like I'll take whatever I can get, versus I will turn down offers that are not good enough. And then if you don't have a closed economy, you can't see the ripple effect of those decisions on future decisions. And that would fit into the difference between humans and animals having to do with verbal behavior, because maybe verbal behavior is necessary to mediate that kind of cross-context generalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good point. So we just have a couple of minutes, and I just want to touch briefly on another study that circles back to some of our earlier discussions about kids with autism. So if you think about this kind of decision-making strategies that are involved here, the humans, in the previous study, the adult humans are taking into account not only the unfairness, but the alternatives that are available, okay? What these authors want to call like the intentions of the proposer. They basically, in this study by Peligra, 2015, compared typically developing kids and kids with autism on this ultimatum game using this same basic payoff matrix. And the main results are summarized here with the typically developing, they call them ND, normal development, showing this kind of decreasing function that's similar to what is seen with the adults in the previous studies. Interestingly, the kids with ASD don't show sensitivity to this. They don't behave like the chimps and accept everything. They reject at about the same level these clearly unfair offers, and so they're sensitive to the fairness variable, but they show no sensitivity to the context, to what the other person had available to them, the other person's intentions. Yeah? And so what they want to argue is that this reflects some social deficits in that the kids with ASD are not what we would say sensitive to the controlling variables for the proposer. Okay, so translate intentions of the proposer to controlling variables for the proposer. And this sort of ties into this, some of the other deficits that have been associated with autism related to perspective taking and theory of mind. And so when they broke down the sample of the kids with ASD into those that passed the theory of mind test and those that didn't, that is, they were able to, in some sense, tact the controlling variables for the proposer. They found that the kids that did pass the perspective taking theory of mind test did this. Okay, so it's not just a difference between typically developing and people with ASD. It has to do with a specific skill deficit, that is, sensitivity to the controlling variables of the other person. So just to sum up this part, social decision making, it's a vast area. And what we know is that people cooperate conditionally. Okay, so they engage in a kind of tit for tat, but if the benefits are not forthcoming or if the inequity becomes too great, they're willing to punish. Sensitive to inequities, and this, some people believe that this has to do with sort of the enforcement of social norms. People will go out of their way to punish those that are not conforming to the social norms. Okay, we're just about out of time, so let me wrap up. So, what have we learned? This is a huge area. I believe that it's a very exciting area for behavior analysis to be involved in. What are the main contributions that we might make to this to this area of social behavior. There are a couple. One is methodological. We have the best methods. And, you know, I spend a lot of time reading literatures outside of behavior analysis. And while there's lots of really interesting work out there, the methods often are very crude. They're not very rigorous. And we have the best methods. So this gives us confidence in approaching virtually any area outside of our field, knowing that we can lead with our methods, and that our methods are going to be effective and useful. The comparative. Developing these methods, I think, has particular. What we've studied only a small range of species so far from a behavior analytic perspective and social behavior, but we have to believe that we're tapping into something that is foundational, that's general, that cuts across different species. And if so, this can be really helpful in a cross-species analysis of social behavior, providing a common methodological framework for understanding social behavior across species, across settings, and providing balanced and meaningful comparisons across species. And this kind of sharper analysis may contribute, among other things, to identifying functional units of behavior. This is something I've really been trying to emphasize throughout the talk, identifying foundational functional units of behavior that can be really useful in interdisciplinary dialogue. One of the most exciting things about an interdisciplinary approach is that there are lots of different methods and concepts and ideas from different disciplines that infuse the science. One of the most frustrating things about interdisciplinary science is that there are diverse methods and concepts and ideas. We're often talking about the same thing, but in different ways. And so it's my hope that in identifying functional units of behavior that can be broadly useful across domains, this can foster productive interdisciplinary dialogue. It allows us to a common language. And finally, translational. As I said at the beginning, most of what I've talked about is from the experimental point of view, but I'm a strong believer in translational work that connects basic principles in the laboratory to applications. And that's where you all come in. This is your job as practitioners and as applied researchers to take this basic analysis and to use it in solving and addressing problems of social significance. But I think that the field can move forward most rapidly and most productively with this kind of integrated approach that includes experimental and applied work. Bottom line is, social behavior is a huge area. It's an area of enormous conceptual importance, and we need to do more. So, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you to Dr. Hackenberg for the session. As expected, I think that this session was both informative and just incredibly interesting. So remember that anyone seeking social work CEUs must sign in and out daily at the registration desk. Please complete an evaluation for this session through the conference website. The session number is 17, and the speaker was Dr. Tim Hackenberg. And everybody I know is waiting for the code. So the code for this session was RUS 298. RUS 298. Thanks so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.